This video is one in a series that my partner Joe Myler and I decided to put together because we have for many years been working on a nonlinear program and approach to learning for managers and employees. But for people to understand what that means and what that is and what the value of it is, they need to understand what knowledge really is and what learning really is in the post-industrial age. And people don't know, for the most part, what these are. We began the previous video, the previous two videos actually, talking about linear thinking and how the industrial age was the culmination, basically, the assembly line was the culmination of linear thinking. What we mean by linear thinking is thinking that is sequential, thinking that is focused on objects and actions, thinking that parses, divides, fragments, and analyzes things into pieces without a comprehension of the whole. Linear thinking has no peripheral vision. So people generally think that the way they think, the linear ways in which they think, are the only ways to think, and the only ways that human beings can handle knowledge. And in fact, there's an entire industry based on those false premises, and that is the industry of knowledge management, which really fundamentally, as I'll explain here, doesn't have very much at all to do with knowledge and has very little to do with management. What it most has to do with is the creation of a commodity that is reproducible and that can be moved around. That's what linear thinking does best. And there are times when you do need an assembly line. I use assembly line thinking and linear thinking pretty much interchangeably. But I mentioned in one of the other videos that you could also call it project thinking. In our age, of course, assembly lines are kind of an outmoded thing to talk about, but our thinking in businesses is completely outmoded and based on premises from the 19th century. So that's just the way it is. Linear thinking has a long history, and the way we define the scientific method, and again I explained much of this in a previous video, is based on linear thinking. We only see, appreciate, and actually use the visible, objective, measurable parts of what the scientific method, how the scientific method operates. But actually, if you go to the scientists and their physical, emotional, personal, individual experience, there is a whole body of different way of thinking that has to do with intuition, that has to do with imagination, that has to do with insight, that is not included in the definitions of the scientific method because linear thinking can't grasp them. And since linear thinking is the basis of how we think, that's why I like to say you can't think out of the box if your thinking is the box. And linear thinking propagates itself. The main thing it creates is more assembly lines. That's why it's so tasky. I remember reading an interview with a senior manager in a very well-known international tech company some years ago. And he mentioned with great pride that on Saturdays he would dedicate the entire day to responding to and dealing with 1,000 emails. That was his goal. Now think about this. 1,000 emails, one by one. That's what linear thinking does. Linear thinking looks to create a commodity. And commodities have to be reproducible and homogeneous. And that's what knowledge management attempts to do. I've followed a lot of what has been written about knowledge management, and I can tell you this. There's pretty much no place where you couldn't substitute most researchers and practitioners and consultants' use of the term knowledge for useful, usable information. It's basically useful, usable information that gets packed into databases or information bases or knowledge bases or whatever you want to call them. But there is such a universe of things that knowledge management doesn't even consider. For one thing, it doesn't consider what knowledge really is in the human body, which is kind of ironic. Knowledge management isn't open to the scientific information about how the brain works. That has been flooding us with discoveries and with new information. Knowledge management is based on the same assembly line thinking that you can define and commoditize a product, and you can install it in one place, and you can also move it around and have this connectivity, and you're back in the assembly line. Knowledge management also creates lots of assembly lines because that's the nature of linear thinking. So if you go to the books and the recommendations of the consultants, there is an infinity of things that have to be done for that motion and that creativity. But no one addresses the fact, at least no one that I've read or seen, that knowledge is perishable. Knowledge is not an enduring commodity. You create these repositories, whatever you want to call them, and the knowledge that's in them is based on situations, circumstances, information, jobs, and organizational culture, markets, clients, customers, and products that are changing all the time. But again, the assembly line looks for things and expects things to be static and unchanging and cookie cutter. That's the focus of what it does. I was going to do this video giving examples of some of the different definitions of knowledge, because there's many of them. They seem to coincide in understanding that a computer can't hold knowledge. I mean, really, let's face it, a computer cannot know. But what happens with the definitions in the books that I've looked at, and I've been looking at books on knowledge management for, how long has it been out? Some 15 years or so. Really, what happens is the definitions are all trying to parse certain types of information and shoehorn them into a particular definition of knowledge. But then what happens in the books is, in the very next paragraph, in some cases, they use the term knowledge and the term information interchangeably. And so I go through the book inserting one term or the other and trying to find out, okay, earlier on you said this, where is it? Some of them use definitions that they never refer to again later at all. Excuse me. No. So really, the methodology is suspect because of what it leads out. There's no consideration that I can find anywhere of what learning really is, of the issue of meaning, of the issue of how the human body and the embodied brain, and I'll go back to that term embodied brain, how the embodied brain assimilates information, and what the body does to create knowledge inside of itself. There's no consideration of any of that. We're simply packaging a product and moving it around, and we're attempting to define the product as homogeneous, standardized. But knowledge is far from homogeneous in any dimension. So there is a huge body of research into how the human body perceives. Neurolinguistics and brain neurology has made extraordinary leaps in the last 10 years. And there is so much that has been discovered about how the brain works. And it's really extraordinary. It really is extraordinary what has come to light. But there are some things that have been around for a long time. There's some information we know about the brain and how it assimilates information that we've known for 50 years that isn't taken into account at all whatsoever in the descriptions and definitions of knowledge management at all. 50 years of research. One example of this is the fact that we have known for half a century that the human body assimilates information at quantities that are vastly greater than what the conscious brain can assimilate, understand, and perceive. Now, researchers define bits as the smallest unit of information that the body can take in, and they have their own definitions of how that is perceived in the brain. For example, they describe that the eye takes in, I forget if it's 1 or 2 million